Coming off the monumental success of the Sega Genesis, Sega decided to improve upon certain aspects of that console. What was not known at the time were decisions from Sega's upper management with relation to the Sony PlayStation, which was released the same year, that would later have irreversible consequences for Sega as a gaming company. The early deaths of the Sega CD, 32X attachment, and Sega Saturn consoles, and later on the eventual fate of the Dreamcast. With the groundbreaking success from the Genesis, Sega was actually ahead of Nintendo and a premier name when it came to video games, consoles, and products. A critical early decision of Sega was to distance itself from the child-friendly Nintendo with more mature and serious games. This proved to be a key aspect of Sega's early successes. Though Nintendo and Sega were often waging war going back and forth, the instinct to always be ahead was a key aspect from Sega. This was a decision that would arguably decide the fate of the company. The first mistake was the fact that Sega placed too much faith into the Genesis when it was time to develop and create and later release a new system. Unlike modern gaming where consoles are released every few years, Sega as well as Nintendo did not believe or comprehend of such a concept at the time. In 1991, Sega released the Sega CD, which in and of itself was a decent concept. Just expand upon an existing console for extra gaming strength. But the CD didn't have too much of a gaming library to choose from. This did not really make gamers decide to go out and buy the Sega CD, and because of this, it ended up being a failure. The second mistake was the 32X. This was a device that actually allowed the 16-bit processing Genesis to play 32-bit processed games. This was one of the first examples that brought modern three-dimensional gaming to consumers and allowed a graphics, technology, and innovation for games in general. At least that was presented by Sega at the time. However, this add-on was a victim of the technology that created it. And to buy the 32X, you essentially had to pay the same amount of money that you would give if you were to buy a completely new Genesis system. And exactly as the Sega CD, there wasn't a strong enough gaming library selection for it. A combination of news that Sega was working on a new 32-bit console meant that most gamers would simply wait for the new console rather than buy and play with or invest time, money, and effort in the Sega CD or 32X. A little known fact is that Sega could have stopped the Sony PlayStation from being created. The circumstances were that though the Sega CD ended up a failure, it established a partnership. The engineers at Sega didn't know that much about the then new compact disc technology, so to help partially develop their new console, they turned to another electronics company that did, Sony. While the sales and public relations of the Sega CD was poor, the concept and technology was actually revolutionary. Sega of America's CEO Tom Kalinske knew that compact discs were the future and proposed a groundbreaking proposition to the Japanese headquarters to develop their console as a partnership with Sony. With this idea in mind, the two companies could split the cost of development and production and produced a shared console at the pinnacle of technological standards at the time. The Japanese management reviews the idea. Sega assumed that they lose money on each console of the next generation technology that they would sell. Their own plan was to make all of the profit as well as all of the games and technology themselves. Added to that, Sega had more game producing experience than Sony did at the time, and the possible partnership seemed to benefit Sony more than it did to Sega. But Sony knew that there was something to this, deciding to go ahead anyway and releasing their own console, the original PlayStation in 1994. They used compact discs as the gaming storage. If the Japanese Sega leadership had only listened to the idea from the American, then the modern gaming dominance of Sony and its legacy of PlayStation systems and games and overall technology might never have happened at all. Despite Sony coming out as a rival in 1994, PlayStation dominance would not come immediately. Sega progressed with its new system, the Saturn. Unlike the 32X, which was a port or could be viewed in modern times as an adapter, the Saturn was a true 32-bit processing console running off of CDs. The plan, as before with the Genesis, was to beat Nintendo to the market with its own console and dominate sales once again. There was doubts from upper Sega Japanese management because CDs were still new technology. Cartridges were the standard of video game storage and consoles were built around them. Doubts began to emerge while the Saturn was being developed. Sega had legitimate reasons to be afraid of CDs. Both the Sega CD and 32X had failed, so they believed the Saturn could as well. The third problem was internal Sega divisions and fears over the future with CD technology. Resources and development would be put towards yet another 32-bit console, codenamed Jupiter. It would have most of the features of the Saturn but would use cartridges instead of CDs. Sega management actually had plans to release both the Saturn and Jupiter consoles at the same time and try to please both groups of gamers who supported traditional cartridges and those who were open-minded enough to try the new CDs. This meant that Sega was now developing and trying to convince studios to support, develop, and create games for 3 different consoles: the 32X, the Saturn, and the Jupiter. In the final months before the actual release of the Sega Saturn, the Jupiter was cancelled. But the division of resources and developmental focus took away from the Saturn, and the best possible console that it could have theoretically been. When the Saturn was officially released in November of 1994 in Japan, the console greatly impressed the Japanese gaming audience, and all available consoles were sold out. A strong showing for the Saturn in Japan. Sega and the Saturn was the first pillar of gaming to release a 32-bit console, getting ahead of old rival Nintendo and new rival Sony with the original PlayStation still in development. The new and more powerful gaming engine was able to handle more 3D gaming and render polygons at a smoother frame rate. This would be a direction that the entire industry would follow in later years. The fourth problem would be, during the launch of the Saturn was a port of the arcade game Virtua Fighter. There was no other game that could play as good as that one, which was a key reason for the exceptional Japanese showing. Besides that example, there wasn't much else to recommend for or about the Saturn. Sonic the Hedgehog was nowhere to be seen, and technically would never arrive on the console at all. Sega was developing a Sonic game for the Saturn, but it had been cancelled, leaving the console without a Sonic game at launch. Though the developmental team at Sega was working on the said game, which was Sonic Extreme, most focus went into Knights. Despite the strong showing in Japan, the gaps in game selection for the Saturn was an omen. The Sega CD and 32X had been killed off early by lack of a gaming library for people to play from, and if the Saturn repeated this problem again, Sega would lose its edge against its competition and become overwhelmed by Nintendo and Sony. And Sony in particular would later take advantage of this very fact. The fifth problem was the American launch of the Saturn. After the successful Japanese debut, Sega turned its attention to E3, which was Electronic Entertainment Expo, which was the largest trade show in the world for gaming. The Japanese leadership wanted the Saturn to dominate the event, but Sony would also announce the American release of its own console, the PlayStation. Desperate to beat the PlayStation to the American gaming market, word came down from then Sega president Hayao Nakayama that the Saturn had to be available for purchase directly after the E3 event, literally after the announcement, as on the same day of the announcement later on. The American CEO of Sega, Tom Kalinske, again thought that this strategy was madness, since he knew Sega's production facilities wouldn't be able to build enough consoles on time from Hayau's demand. Regardless, he went to E3 and announced that the Saturn was not only there, but ready to be bought by consumers. More bad news was the price of the console at launch. The American sales price at the time was $399, vastly expensive at the time. Sega's Japanese leadership once again predicted early sales and hype would be the main drive behind consumer demand. They assumed that if the Saturn consoles were on store shelves and no competition was there to choose from besides the Saturn, then the Saturn would leap into a market lead. Then successful sales from the Saturn would help Sega when Sony released its PlayStation. But for this idea to work, there had to be consoles at stores to sell, and this wasn't really possible. Before internet sales made buying things easy or even lazy for people, you would need to physically go to stores to buy things. And if something wasn't there, then it was just your own bad luck. What made things worse is that when Sega fought against Nintendo during the era of the Genesis, both sides made pitches to try and earn favor of retailers to sell the consoles and games. Sega's American CEO Tom Kalinske didn't want to anger any of the American retailers, but his own orders from Hayao Nakayama forced him to demand that retailers have the Saturn systems in stock. Supply was so low that potential customers went from store to store thinking that consoles might be there to purchase, but only to be turned away because of the lack of consoles. Consumer disappointment was growing, combined with no real drive to buy Saturn consoles because of lack of a gaming library, nor any positive consumer word of mouth, left Sega without any edge it had earned from the Japanese launch. This was a signal to Sony to kill off the Saturn. The sixth problem was that Sony carefully avoided all of Sega's mistakes with the Saturn. Wanting press attention for the Saturn, it got all of it for the wrong reasons. With lack of Saturn consoles and an overall expensive price, Sony decided to make announcements as well during the E3 events. When it came time to mention to consumers how much the console was, a representative said $299 and that was it. Such a price was heard around the world that the new PlayStation was cheaper overall than the Saturn was. Combined with this, Sony was able to pack the consoles into retail markets, so everyone had merchandise to sell and gamers could buy whenever or wherever they wanted. The PlayStation library was extensive because of Sony's connections to various game developers, and this only increased in the following years. The Sony PlayStation's graphics processor was easy to codify and make games for. Any developers that weren't seduced by Sony abandoned the Saturn, and quickly Sega was left largely alone. The seventh and final problem for the Saturn was that it ended up being the weakest console out of the generation of consoles from the mid to late 1990s. The PlayStation was also 32 bits, but it was easy to make games for because of the console dynamics. For third-party development, it made much easier to develop games overall for Sony rather than Sega. As mentioned, this contributed greatly to the deeper and more expansive library than the Saturn when it came to games. This unexpected battle against Sony weakened Sega. The main focus of Sega was Nintendo, and ironically decided to skip the 32-bit era completely, leaping directly from the 16-bit Super Nintendo to the 64-bit console domain. Nintendo was so proud of this decision that they named the console Nintendo 64 after the new 64-bit processing gaming technology. The shame is that again, Sega could have stopped Nintendo from getting their hands on the processing technology at all. Silicon Graphics, a major chipset manufacturer, had actually approached Sega first about producing their chips for the Sega Saturn, and divisions with Sega as the American branch supported the notion, and the Japanese branch refused the concept. Silicon Graphics then proposed the exact same idea to Nintendo, and they accepted. The result of this was the N64. As the 1990s decade ended, Sega, whom entered as the strongest developer, was defeated and humiliated by Nintendo and Sony. The Saturn ended up having a short lifespan. Tom Kalinske, the American CEO of Sega of America, walked away from the company after his crucial requests, demands, and warnings were ignored. Sega decided not to end things like this. They would come back into gaming stronger than ever. The plans were for another console to compete with Sony that had taken over from their spot as the dominant video game developer. This would be, and this was, the Sega Dreamcast, which in and of itself is another discussion entirely. But sadly, despite the Dreamcast being ahead of its time, it was again defeated by Sony and the PlayStation 2. With all of these mistakes by Sega, with the Sega CD port, 32X upgrade, and the Sega Saturn, the concept of the Sega Saturn could have been vastly different if the Japanese leadership had just done some simple problems differently.